I'm Mike Ward, and welcome to Conversations in Healthcare, a video series brought to you by DRG, part of Clarivate. This episode is one of a number that we're recording alongside On Helix, a digital conference that's been hosted by One Nucleus. The overarching title of that meeting is Transforming New Medicine Discovery. To do this effectively and sustainably, organizations need to have confidence that the approaches they're taking will deliver a return on investment. So in light of this, I thought it might be useful for us to look at some of the key business challenges that companies face as they seek to translate discoveries into tangible benefits for patients, whether it's early stage biotechs looking at the resource trade-offs in an R&D pipeline, biotechs with commercial ambitions, needing to develop tactical marketing plans, or those others who are in that space. So I'm delighted to be joined by my colleague, my DRG colleague, Srikanth Rajagopal, although we call him Doc. Doc is a partner at DRG Consulting. He's based out of London, and his areas of expertise include product and portfolio strategy, pricing, reimbursement, and access across Europe and emerging markets, transaction advisory, and commercial strategy. So, Doc, I hope you and those you care about are keeping well and safe, and thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Mike. Pleasure to be on Conversations on Healthcare, and look forward to our discussion today.
Great. So, as we know, within the life sciences ecosystem, no company, not even the largest multinationals, has all the answers they need to successfully translate a discovery into a tangible medicine. What are the most common challenges biotechs come to you when asking for help?
Sure. So a lot of the work that we do, Mike, with biotechs focuses on companies that have assets that are progressing to phase 2 and beyond. And some of the typical questions, as you could imagine, relate to a decision. And that decision almost invariably is related to investment. So when we think about prioritizing an indication, which indication to go for an asset in order to optimize asset value. Another decision could be a go, no-go decision on investing in phase 3 development, given the likely value on commercialization. Another decision could be geographic expansion. A lot of biotech clients of ours are based in the US, and for them, incremental value in Europe or major emerging markets is a significant question, not simply because of the value in those markets, but also sometimes the risk from a pricing perspective, from a competitive perspective. So we support clients on a range of such decisions. And the last but not the least, of course, is licensing out. Many biotechs may not have the commercial wherewithal to do it all on their own. And in those situations, we advise them not just on who to partner with, but potentially how much to partner for.
Right. Okay. So let's look specifically at some of those areas. Many biotechs these days they're able to transform themselves into commercial businesses, and so retain as much value from their assets as possible, and they do that by focusing on orphan indications. In your experience, what are the sort of the key business questions that a company would have to address, if it was looking to sort of exploit that orphan opportunity?
Sure. So when biotechs come to us and when they have an orphan indication, then very oftentimes the question that the most important question is, yes, we understand that this asset is indicated for an orphan indication, but can you give us a sense of what the addressable patient population is? And that's oftentimes not a very straightforward question to answer, because whilst sizing an orphan population on the surface is relatively straightforward, one has to consider a number of different dimensions. For example, line of therapy. That can impact your addressable patient population. What could also impact your patient population could be a treatment protocol or a treatment guideline that means that your asset is in some ways limited to a certain population, which you may not have trialed the asset for as part of your baseline plan. Other issues related to sizing an addressable population relate to challenges with diagnosis, challenges pinpointing those diagnosed patients and bringing them to a center of care. So a lot of issues related to just how big is my patient pool is a significant step one question, right? Following that, once we've addressed the question of how big is my target patient pool, how sizable is the opportunity, then comes the question of how do I actually engage that patient pool? How do I activate that patient pool? And how can I get that patient pool to clinic? And once they're in clinic, on my therapy? And that presents another significant strategic question that oftentimes orphan companies may not have all the answers for, and that's where we support them. Once that question is addressed, there's the obvious question of how do I optimize the pricing and access environment for my asset, and how do I, in conjunction with price and access, get my asset to market as fast as possible. And getting that triangle of price, time, and volume right is in some ways the magic triangle. And that's what orphan companies oftentimes, I wouldn't say struggle to get right, but they do oftentimes require support. And that's where we come in. And once we've addressed those, what I would call revenue line questions, then we come to the cost side of the equation. And oftentimes clients do ask us for our views or our recommendations on what the commercial strategy should look like, what their commercial infrastructure should look like, what the access infrastructure should look like, what that translates to into operating expenses, and ultimately what that translates to into their NPV. And all of those are areas where we support our clients.
Okay, so the outcomes that there are these sort of specific questions, and then you will be sort of delivering some answers. So what does that sort of that delivery look like? I mean, can you give us a for instance?
Sure. So as an example, we worked with a company that was in phase 3 for an orphan indication. And it was an interesting indication in that there hadn't been a lot of clinical development or innovation in that indication for a number of years. Our client had a novel formulation. It was differentiated. It had a clear benefit in terms of convenience. It had a clear benefit in terms of its efficacy. However, their clinical trial wasn't optimized for markets outside of the US. And what that meant is that they needed to then take a strategic decision on one, whether to adapt their clinical development program to meet the requirements of regulators and payers in Europe. And that meant investment, right? And before making that investment, they actually wanted to understand whether the commercial opportunity in Europe was actually big enough for them to then consider that investment. So that was the problem case. What we did was, as I mentioned earlier, a sequential drill down of the commercial opportunity for the asset. So we looked at the epidemiology. They had certain estimates of prevalent diagnosed and incident population that were subject to some discrepancies. And we did a thorough literature review. We spoke to KOLs, looked at registry information and got a better sense of what that addressable patient pool was. We then looked at the competitive environment. As I mentioned, most of the therapies in the indication were in some ways legacy therapies. Generics were coming into the market. That meant additional competitive threat, not just from the incumbent innovators, but also from generics. And as we all know, in Europe, once generics come in, even if they're not head-to-head competitors from a formulation perspective, payers do consider them as your competitor, and that impacts your price potential. So we looked at KOL and payer perceptions of the asset. We conducted analog analysis, understood what the likely price corridor for the reformulation would be, and basis the analysis on the patient pool, basis the analysis on the competitive landscape and the potential competitive threat or share that the asset could get, and the analysis of pricing and access potential, we got to a fairly robust scenario-based assessment of the revenue potential of the asset. As I mentioned before, looked at what kind of access and commercial infrastructure would be required, and gave them a scenario-based assessment of what they might realize in terms of profit should they go ahead and commercialize in Europe. And this gave them a much better sense of what they might realize if they made the investment in the clinical development program versus a competitor, as opposed to a placebo in the US. So they're now in that process of considering their next phase development program for Europe. And the recommendations were I would say, appreciated by senior management, because they got clarity. They could provide their board clarity. They could provide investors clarity as to what their strategy for Europe would be. And as you can imagine, that is a key question for biotechs in the US, and that's what we happen to specialize in.
Right. So, I mean, one of the so in the past, biotechs would normally take an asset to proof of concept.
Yep.
I mean, the fact that we now have, sort of orphan diseases, etc., they can sort of move forward. But actually, we're sort of seeing that, companies are actually realizing that they can capture more value, they can sort of build critical mass by sort of, maintaining control of their assets, which of course that means that they are, essentially, looking at the, the go, no go decision. So when companies get to sort of, that phase 2 go, no go decision, I mean, what sort of, experience have you had again, sort of, helping companies out with that sort of approach?
So I think the one area that we as DRG Consulting specialize in is decision analysis, right? It's the application of decision science to make better informed decisions. And in those particular situations, what clients really value is the fact that we can assign not just a number to value and risk, but also provide them a sense of what drives value and what drives risk. What are those market level threats? What are those competitive threats? What are the regulatory threats? And the pricing and reimbursement, or the payer environment threats that impact the value of the asset. And in making a go, no go decision, it's important not just to have, in some ways, a baseline assessment of the asset's value and risk, but more importantly, what alternatives exist on the table by way of strategic alternatives. And a good example is some recent work that we did with a company that had an asset in phase 2, and they were behind the competition. So for them, it was really important to be able to make an informed judgment on whether it was worthwhile to actually proceed with development for the asset, given it was a crowded space. It was one that their baseline assessments indicated to them that they would not make a lot of money. But then, as you can imagine, biotechs don't have that many assets to play with. So it's important for them to use the client's own words, squeeze the juice out of the asset. And that meant for them to go back to the drawing board and assess, okay, is there a way in which we can innovate? Is there a way in which we can differentiate this asset and drive some incremental value as opposed to canning it? So they came to us, asked us, can you help? And that's where we, from a consultative perspective, believed we could. And the reason for that is, of course, not just the fact that we have world-class epidemiologists, not just we have world-class experts in different disease areas, but we also have pharmacologists on our team. We have doctors on our team. And that allows us to work directly with clinical development and medical teams in client companies and merge that collective insight into development of what we call TPP alternatives. So what we did in this case was we looked at a range of different alternatives and through an iterative process, convinced ourselves that there were alternatives that were clinically viable, feasible for development, and commercially compelling in that they drove incremental value over and above the baseline TPP. And some of those alternatives involved looking at a larger population where there was no indication within the overall, where there was no asset indicated within the overall indication, but which required a biomarker in order to stratify populations that were at higher risk of progression. And that was unique, that was innovative, hadn't been done before. Involved risk, but was at least something that the client could consider as an alternative to drive more value. Another option we considered was going head to head versus the closest competitor. Obviously, that's a risky strategy, but in an environment where you need to differentiate, you need to show some level of statistical superiority or at least non-inferiority. It was important to consider that alternative and the pros and cons and the associated risks of that alternative. And last but not the least, looking at an alternative that involved combination. If their asset on a standalone basis couldn't drive the value they were expecting, could they combine it with an existing asset from a different mechanism of action class and demonstrate the combined efficacy being superior to current standard of care? So again, those were examples of the different alternatives that we developed and designed. And what we did was we then took each alternative through a rigorous process of evaluation of value and risk. And that involved the standard methodological techniques that I mentioned. So speaking to KOLs, speaking to payers, running a quantitative analysis with a conjoint, and driving a level of analytical rigor and robustness that from a client satisfaction perspective gave them the comfort and confidence to consider the different options on the table. In the end, and I won't necessarily state what the outcome was, but in the end, they walked away with a much better sense of the alternatives and therefore were able to come to a much better informed decision as to what to do next from a go no-go perspective. And this is important because oftentimes clients do, because they've made investments in a certain program, there's oftentimes a bit of a sunk cost orientation where we the investments, so let's plow on or not. But oftentimes it's important to step back and reevaluate your situation, look at alternatives, and then evaluate those alternatives, not worrying about what has been invested in the past, because that is the past and it doesn't affect your future value. So supporting clients and helping clients make those kinds of informed decisions are what we do well. That was an example of, in some ways, developing alternative asset, alternative DPPs for an asset. And those are the kinds of, I would say, projects that drive value for clients, and that's why we well, they come back to us.
So what? Yeah, when a company, say for example, it's not sort of developing an asset that's for sort of a classical unmet medical need, but actually as I think you sort of saying, there was one of the options you've already discussed is where it was already sort of fairly crowded space. So when a company is looking to, I guess, sort of, suggest or show that it has an alternative, better approach to patient care, what sort of issues do you encourage management teams to be thinking about? How can they ensure that they're going to win sort of share of voice in that crowded market, both amongst physicians and also patients?
Good question, Mike. I guess when we're working with companies that have assets that aren't necessarily differentiated, are operating in crowded markets, and have to cut through the clutter, so to speak, then, as I mentioned in the previous use case, we do need to come to the table with a range of different alternatives, which are, to the point I mentioned before, clinically viable, developmentally feasible, and commercially compelling. And in so doing, there are a few foundational principles as far as the analysis is concerned. And aside of what I mentioned, one important fundamental principle is when we've gotten to a point where we don't believe any of the options or any of the alternatives make sense. In our past experience, we've not shied away from letting the client know, look, we've reached a dead end. There is no value in this particular program. Then that in itself triggers interesting discussions as to, okay, it may not be valuable for us, but could it be valuable for another company or another asset owner, another developer? And that could be for a range of different reasons. It could be because they have deeper pockets and are willing to absorb the risk of development, which our client may not be. It could be that they already have an asset in the indication, and for them, therefore, the value bringing in this additional asset as a follow-on is something that they can consider, as opposed to a new entrant, which has a higher barrier to entry in that particular indication. So it's not just looking at options in-house, it's also looking at options externally. And that's a process that we actively encourage clients to consider, especially if they're open to potential licensing out or potential partnership. Many times in the environment that we work in, biotechs have, and to your point, Mike, earlier, biotechs are going through the cycle of advancing their own assets through in-house commercialization, as opposed to say 5 or 10 years ago, where out-licensing was the model. But it's important for biotechs to still maintain the option of the out-license or the partner on the table. And in many cases, when you do the valuation of the asset, assuming a partner's capabilities or a partner's infrastructure, then you might actually realize that it makes more sense and it creates more value to consider the out-license, consider the sale. And that's something that we, to the point I mentioned earlier, in terms of areas we operate in, we do support companies with those out-licensing evaluations to ensure that we've evaluated all options on the table and we create value for the client.
So in the examples you've shared, what does engagement between your team and the sort of the client actually look like? I mean, how long is the sort of the process, and are these just discrete one-off arrangements? How does it work?
Sure. Well, pre-COVID, we would engage with clients fairly collaboratively, fairly, I would say, intensively, in that most oftentimes projects start off with an intensive kickoff and mobilization phase where we spend a fair bit of time in working sessions with the clients, understanding their current asset, the profile, the TPP, all the work that's been done so far in terms of clinical development, shape the research plan or the business questions together, and then advance forward into a research and analytical phase. That involves building hypotheses, that involves structuring the research and the analysis, whether it's primary, whether it's analog analysis, whether it's doing literature search for epidemiology or competition, doing all the analysis that leads us into the eventual analysis for the valuation or for the financial modeling or for the revenue forecasting. And then, of course, once we've done that, we come back to the client, present results. And what we try and do more often than not is not just leave them with the outputs or outcomes of the analysis, but try and give them a tangible sense of, so what does this mean for you from a strategy perspective? Should you invest or not? Should you expand geographically or not? Should you partner or keep in-house? And that kind of decision orientation, which is the culmination of the project, is what drives value for the client in terms of engaging with us. Typically, these kind of engagements for emerging biopharma companies or biotech companies would last between 6 to 10 or 12 weeks, depending on how complex the problem is. As I said, we try and engage very collaboratively. Oftentimes, the best results are ones where there's iterative refinement of the hypotheses, there's active contribution to the research instruments, there's significant pressure testing of the financial model, the financial evaluation, and the recommendations. And as I mentioned before, more often than not, clients appreciate the analytical rigor. They appreciate the guidance and the direction that we provide, the recommendations we make. And therefore, the way we structure our engagements, we always leave the door open for follow-on work. And clients oftentimes come back to us with either the next phase of the same question, or come back to us asking for a similar analysis on a different asset or a different indication. And that's how we build a relationship. That's how we build trust.
Right. So, as a sort of final question, and this is it's almost like the bottom line question. Biotech management, they're constantly looking at sort of return on investment. Sort of very much it's around sort of preserving the sort of the capital resources that they have. So I can imagine that many in the audience are going to sort of saying, while they're agreeing that sort of the insights that you and your team can provide are going to be useful, they're probably sort of thinking, but how much does this cost, and could we afford it?
Sure. So I guess the way that we structure our engagements is we typically structure them or structure our fees based on the time we spend, the effort we expend, and the expertise that we bring to the table. And whilst sometimes the price tag can be one that biotechs, especially pre-revenue biotechs, find somewhat prohibitive, the truth is we adopt a flexible modular orientation. So we oftentimes work with clients where we can break down the problem statement into its constituent parts. And then instead of going for a single project, you can actually split that up into multiple projects, and kind of almost in a stage-gated process, unpeel the onion, right, so to speak. And clients appreciate that. And that's part of our flexible boutique orientation. That being said, there have been clients that have given urgency, given immediacy to address the strategic question. They have gone with us, and at the end, in my experience, most clients have appreciated the value that we brought to the table, and they've recognized that it's money well spent. And that's a function of, again, the strategic recommendation, because we can demonstrate the value for the biotech in concrete financial terms. And when they communicate that back to their investors, case in point, we actually do have a biotech that's come back to us, and they may be considering going public this year. And they've actually come back to us asking for guidance on their strategy, which impacts their going public. And that's on the back of work that we did with them before. So whilst there was, as you can imagine, a bit of negotiation that happened the first time around, the second time they want to work with us because they saw the value.
Yeah, good. So Doc, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me today. The insights that you're sharing, I'm sure going to be of great interest to a lot of the audience, wherever they are in the healthcare system. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Mike. Appreciate it, and have a great rest of the day.
So if after listening to this broadcast, you'd like to tune into future conversations in health, follow our LinkedIn page where we'll be posting alerts to future episode releases. So in closing, I'd like to thank Doc again for joining us, and thank you, our listeners, for tuning in. So until next time, stay safe and healthy. I'm Mike Ward, and I'll see you in the next episode.